The sound of sirens blurred into the ringing in my ears. I couldn't tell what was louder, the chaos outside or the chaos inside my head. Everything felt numb, my arms, my legs, even my thoughts. My vision was foggy, but I could make out movement above me. A paramedic shouting something I couldn't process. A mask covered my mouth. My chest burned. Blood was everywhere. I knew I was hurt. Badly. Somewhere nearby, another body was strapped down. My brother Caleb. I couldn't see him, but I heard the panic in the medics' voices as they rushed to stabilize both of us. Then above it all, a voice I knew. My mother's. "If she's not going to make it anyway," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. "Can we at least use her organ to save Caleb?" I couldn't move, couldn't speak, but I heard every word. There was a pause, the kind that chills your bones even when you're bleeding out. "Ma'am, the doctor said clearly, stunned, your daughter is alive. She's critical, but her vitals are holding." "She's just a girl," my mother snapped. "She hasn't even done anything with her life. Caleb has a future. He can do things that matter. What's the point of letting her suffer if she can save him?" My heart didn't break. It hardened. I wasn't unconscious. I wasn't gone. I was right there, strapped to that stretcher, breathing through a machine, listening to my own mother decide that I was expendable, replaceable, a storage unit for spare parts. I wanted to scream, but my throat only let out a whimper. No one heard it. The doctor pushed back, saying something about ethics, about how this wasn't a battlefield, but her voice had already carved into me deeper than the glass in my ribs. She didn't even cry. She didn't ask if I was okay. She just wanted to know if my death could mean something for her golden boy. I lay there soaked in blood and betrayal, realizing a truth no child should have to face. They didn't love me, they tolerated me. And in that moment, they would have rather buried me with an empty chest than imagine a world without Caleb in it. I was 17. I had never rebelled, never yelled, never asked for more than scraps of their attention. But that night in the back of a speeding ambulance, I made a vow, not aloud, but in the silence of my broken body. If I lived, I would never forget. And I would never let them forget either, not for a second. Growing up, I was the quiet one. Not by choice, by necessity. Silence was the only way to survive in a house where one child shined so brightly there was no room left for anyone else to be seen. My name is Nora Ellison. I was born second 2 years after my brother Caleb. From the very beginning, it was clear who mattered more. Caleb was golden from the start. Blonde hair, easy smile, straight A's without trying state-level athlete by 14. People adored him. Teachers praised him. And my parents built their entire identity around his success. I was the background noise, a polite whisper in a home full of applause for someone else. Our mother Diane was the engine of that machine. She had a way of looking at you that made you feel smaller than you were. Not cruel on the surface, just calculated. Every question was a test. Every response weighed against how it reflected on her image. My father, Alan, was quieter. He didn't drive the machine, but he never once tried to stop it. He nodded and agreed and deferred to whatever Diane said, even if that meant stepping over me. I remember once when I was 9, I got a perfect score on a statewide reading test. I ran home with the paper, my little fingers gripping it so tight, the corners crinkled. My mom barely looked up from her phone. "That's nice," she said. "Did Caleb get his science project finished?" I don't even know if she kept the paper. But I know she framed Caleb's second-place medal from a debate tournament 3 weeks later. At school, I was quiet. I wasn't unpopular, just unremarkable. I had friends, mostly other quiet kids. I read too much, wrote stories no one asked to read, and spent lunch hours in the library. Teachers liked me. No one hated me. But no one ever looked at me the way they looked at Caleb. He wasn't cruel. That's the part people always misunderstand. He never bullied me. He didn't mock me or treat me like dirt. No, Caleb was kind in a distant way. Like a prince, being generous to a peasant, polite, detached. Sometimes he'd pat my head, call me kid, and then go back to his glowing world where I didn't belong. He never defended me, never spoke up when our mom dismissed me at dinner, or when I got blamed for things I didn't do. But he didn't hit me either. I think that's what made it worse. He didn't see me enough to even hate me. I worked hard. I studied. I got into a decent college, nowhere fancy, but solid. I wanted to study biology. I dreamed of becoming a researcher, maybe working in medical ethics. Ironic, right? At 17, all I wanted was a future where I could help others, where I could matter. My parents barely acknowledged my acceptance letter. Caleb had just made captain of his university's lacrosse team. That was the headline in our family. The accident happened on a Tuesday evening. We'd gone to a dinner honoring Caleb's leadership award at school. I was invited because well appearances mattered. It was the first time I'd been to one of his events in months. He drove the four of us back, the four of us being Caleb, me, and our parents. I sat in the back earbuds and pretending to nap while they talked up front about scholarships, internships, and the Ellison name. I remember the lights more than the impact. The screech of tires, the explosion of glass the moment the world flipped. I hit the side window with the left side of my face. There was blood in my mouth, my ribs cracked against the door frame, and for a few seconds I thought the silence meant I had died. Then the voices came, then the pain, then darkness. I don't remember the full ride to the ambulance, but I remember the moment I started to regain consciousness. The air was cold. My body felt like it was being held together by threads, and over the hum of the engine, over the frantic voices of the paramedics, I heard my mother offer up my life like a transaction. Not with grief, not even desperation, with strategy, with calculation. That's who she was. That's who she'd always been. And in that moment, I understood something that had been floating around my life for years but had never landed. To them, I was only valuable if I could serve someone else, if I could improve Caleb's odds, if I could play a part in their carefully curated family success story. And if I couldn't do that, if I was just a girl with broken ribs and a shattered face and a future of limitations, then I wasn't worth the effort. I didn't cry then. I couldn't. There were no tears, no words, no strength. But somewhere deep in the pit of my soul, something shifted. I was done being silent. I would survive. I would fight. Not for their approval, never again. But for something far more important, myself. The first real memory I have of the ambulance is of cold, not the kind of cold that makes you shiver, the kind that makes you feel like you're floating just above your body, like you're watching yourself from somewhere else. I couldn't tell where the pain ended and the numbness began. I heard machines beeping, fabric rustling, voices barking instructions. My chest felt tight, my abdomen on fire. My fingers wouldn't move. My eyes opened just enough to see the ceiling blur past through tiny windows. It was dark outside. I had no idea how long it had been. There were two paramedics in the back. One sat near my head monitoring my vitals. The other moved between me and the figure strapped to the other side, Caleb. I could hear him breathing, rasping. He was alive. That much I could tell. I tried to turn my head to say something, but the moment I did, a white-hot pain shot through my side. I stopped trying. Someone said my name, Nora, like a question. The medic near me leaned closer, checking my pupils. I couldn't answer, but I was awake. I was there. And then I heard it. My mother's voice just outside the ambulance doors. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging for my life. She was doing what she always did, taking control. "We need to do something," she said. "Caleb can't wait." A male voice, probably the doctor, answered. "We're doing everything we can. Both your children are in critical condition. We need to get them stable." I understand that she said sharply. But Caleb's condition is organ-specific. He's losing time. If Nora isn't... If her injuries are beyond recovery, we can't waste the opportunity. We have to think practically. I stopped breathing. There was a beat of silence, followed by the doctor's stunned reply. "Ma'am, are you asking me to... I'm asking if it's possible to use what we can," she interrupted. "She has 2 kidneys, doesn't she? Or her liver, if one of them is salvageable." "Why let it go to waste? She's not dead," the doctor said, clearly angry now. "You don't get to make that decision while she's still breathing." "She's always been sickly," my mother continued, as if listing reasons to give up on me. "Asthma, allergies, weak bones. She's not athletic. She won't live a high-functioning life. But Caleb, he has potential. He has purpose." It wasn't shock I felt. Not really. It was confirmation. This wasn't new. This wasn't some grief-stricken parent saying something irrational in a moment of panic. This was strategy. She had calculated my worth and decided it wasn't enough. And for the first time in my life, I had irrefutable proof of how little I meant to her. I wasn't her daughter. I was her insurance policy. A younger nurse, maybe mid-20s, stepped into the ambulance briefly and froze as she glanced down at me. I looked back at her. Our eyes locked. I couldn't speak, but something in my face must have told her I understood, that I'd heard. Her mouth pressed into a thin line. She adjusted the blanket over me with trembling hands, then turned away. When we reached the emergency bay, everything moved faster. The doors flung open. I was wheeled down bright hallways under harsh fluorescent lights. I caught glimpses of Caleb's stretcher being rushed in a different direction. My mother's voice faded behind me, still issuing instructions like she was in charge of the entire ER. A team of doctors swarmed around me. They asked questions I couldn't answer. My clothes were cut off. An oxygen mask was fitted tighter. Someone mentioned internal bleeding. Then darkness again. When I came to, it was a day later. The pain was duller, managed by medication. My mouth was dry and my arms were tethered to IVs and monitors. A nurse came in, surprised to see me awake. She called for a doctor. Minutes passed. A new nurse entered, adjusted my sheets. I asked, barely, about Caleb. They told me he was stable, recovering in another wing. My parents hadn't visited me, not even once. I already knew why. A day later, I was transferred to a lower-risk room. Rosa, the young nurse from the ambulance, came to check on me. She didn't say much at first. She took my blood pressure, asked how I was feeling. Then, as she turned to leave, she paused at the door. "I was there," she said softly. "I heard what your mother said." I stared at her, unsure if I was supposed to feel ashamed or grateful. Rosa walked back in and sat at the edge of the bed. "I didn't know if you were awake. You didn't react, and I thought maybe—" She looked down. "But when I saw your eyes on the ride, I knew. You heard it. All of it." I nodded slowly. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "That's not how families are supposed to be." I wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, I felt something colder, something firmer, resolve. The next morning, I asked to speak to a hospital social worker. The nurse on duty raised an eyebrow but didn't question it. Within an hour, a woman named Judith entered my room with a clipboard and calm eyes. She pulled a chair next to my bed and waited. "I want to file a report," I said, my voice rough. "Against my parents." Judith blinked, adjusted her glasses, and nodded. "Tell me what happened." I did. Every word, every sound. I recited my mother's lines verbatim. I told her about Rosa, about the doctor who tried to push back. I told her I wanted to be protected, not just from my injuries, but from my own family. Judith didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she stood, placed a gentle hand on my arm, and said, "We'll make sure you're safe, starting today." And just like that, a door closed behind me. Not gently, not with sadness, with clarity. My family had chosen Caleb. Now, I would choose me. The first time I saw my reflection after the surgery, I didn't recognize the girl in the mirror. There were bruises on my neck and face, yellowed and deep like the fading remnants of a storm. My hair was matted, some parts shaved for the head scans. A long, angry scar stretched across my left side, the result of emergency surgery to stop internal bleeding. I stood there, gripping the edge of the sink, my hospital gown slipping off one shoulder. And I thought, this is the body they wanted to cut into again. This is the girl they called useless. The nurses were kind, especially Rosa. She visited when she could, always careful not to cross lines, but she made sure I never felt alone. One afternoon, she slipped me a small notepad and pen. "Sometimes writing helps," she said softly, "even if no one else reads it." I wrote that night, not just what happened, but how it felt. I wrote about the words my mother had said, the stillness in my father's silence, the way the doctor had sounded more human than either of them. I wrote about Rosa's eyes in the ambulance, the gentle way she'd covered me back up when I was exposed and helpless. I wrote about the difference between being seen and being saved. Meanwhile, Judith, the hospital social worker, filed the formal report. With her help, I petitioned for temporary medical guardianship to be transferred to the state, citing evidence of medical coercion and emotional endangerment. It wasn't easy. My parents fought back. They hired a lawyer. My mother even accused the hospital of manipulating me. "They're turning her against us," she told the court-appointed liaison. "She's confused. She's emotionally unstable." But what they didn't know was that the ambulance had recorded part of the conversation. Not everything, but enough. Enough to prove that they were talking about harvesting an organ while I was still alive. It was horrifying, but it was also power. For the first time in my life, I had something undeniable. Something they couldn't gaslight or spin or dismiss as drama. Their voices on tape treating me like a broken appliance to be stripped for parts. The judge granted the transfer of medical rights. I was no longer under their control. No decisions about my body could be made by them again. It didn't end there, of course. My parents showed up at the hospital 3 days later demanding access. They yelled at staff, called me ungrateful, said I was destroying the family. But the hospital had security ready. I watched from the second-floor window as they were escorted out. My mother turned once, her face twisted, not in sadness, but rage, and I remember thinking, she's not mourning a daughter. She's mourning the loss of control. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. A week later, Judith helped me apply for a temporary housing program for youth transitioning out of family guardianship. It wasn't glamorous, a shared apartment in a quiet part of town, a stiff bed walls so thin I could hear my neighbor snore. But it was mine. It was safe. There were locks on the doors, and no one could walk in without knocking. I started physical therapy and took online classes in basic biology and anatomy. I told the caseworker I wanted to study medical ethics. She raised an eyebrow, then smiled. "You're going to change some things." "Huh, I have to," I said. "Not just for me. I didn't want revenge. Not the kind people imagine. I didn't want to hurt my parents. I didn't want to ruin Caleb's life. But I wanted something far more dangerous than revenge. I wanted to remember. Every time they tried to rewrite the past, to erase what they did, to tell themselves they were just scared or desperate, I would still be here, living, breathing, thriving. And I would carry the truth with me like a mirror they couldn't avoid. Some nights I lay awake imagining what they told people. She's unstable. She's always been dramatic. She's making it up. But I didn't need them to believe me. I needed only to build a life strong enough that their story would no longer matter. That's what resistance looked like. Not shouting in the streets, not revenge plots, but calm, determined silence. The refusal to disappear. I applied for a legal name change a few months later. I dropped Ellison. I took the last name Vale from my great-grandmother, someone who'd left an abusive home and built her life from scratch. Someone I never met, but whose photo sat on my nightstand, a soft-eyed woman in a stiff dress smiling like she knew secrets. It felt like claiming myself. And once I had that, once I knew I was truly free from their legal and medical reach, I stopped checking my email for messages from them. I stopped wondering if Caleb was okay. I stopped reading these news blurbs my mother sometimes tried to leak about the tragic, confused daughter who walked away from her family. I walked, yes, but not in confusion, in clarity. They made their choice. Now I was making mine. I moved into my new place with nothing but a suitcase, a stack of medical paperwork, and a borrowed laptop. The apartment was part of a transitional housing program, a place for teens like me, too old for foster care, too young for full independence. It smelled faintly of bleach and dust, and the mattress was about as soft as a sidewalk. But I had a key, my own key. The first thing I did was tape a note above my desk. It read, "They chose him. You choose you." It wasn't poetic, but it was real. I spent the next 6 months rebuilding slowly, clumsily, sometimes painfully. I started physical therapy 3 times a week to regain strength in my left side. My ribs took months to fully heal, and even then I moved like a stitched-up doll for a while. But I walked, I breathed, I made my own meals. I wrote in my journal every night, sometimes just a sentence, sometimes pages of spiraling thought. And I studied. I enrolled in community college under my new name, Nora Vale. The name felt foreign at first, like putting on someone else's coat. But each time I filled out a form or introduced myself in class, it fit a little better. I chose biology as my major. It made sense. I had spent the past year learning how bodies break and mend. Now I wanted to understand how to protect them legally, ethically. I didn't just want to learn the science. I wanted to learn the systems that failed me. I worked part-time at a bookstore downtown, late shifts mostly. The pay was low, but the manager liked me, and the quiet hours meant I could read during slow stretches. I devoured books on ethics, philosophy, case studies, on medical consent. I wasn't trying to be noble. I was trying to make sense of what happened, to make sure no one else would ever be whispered about as a spare part while they were still alive. Caleb never reached out. That didn't surprise me. I had no doubt our mother spun some version of events that painted me as ungrateful or broken. Maybe he believed it. Maybe it was easier than facing what had been said in that ambulance. Maybe it was easier to forget me altogether. But I didn't forget. 3 years passed. I earned my associate's degree, then transferred to a university that offered scholarships for students with special circumstances. I qualified under the medically displaced minor clause, a cold but accurate label. By 22, I was interning at a small bioethics research lab. By 23, I was working full-time on a pilot project designed to propose policy protections for underage patients in family care. It wasn't glamorous, but it was important. And I knew that if I could turn my own story into structure, into law, it would matter. I didn't talk about my past in meetings. I didn't lead with it on job applications. But it was there in every proposal I wrote, in every question I raised about informed consent and ethical oversight. The more I learned, the clearer it became. What my mother asked for wasn't just immoral. In some places, under looser laws, it might have been possible. That terrified me. And it fueled me. At 24, I co-authored my first paper on protective rights for non-consenting minors in emergency medical situations. It gained attention in small circles, academics, legal advocates. A few hospitals reached out. One even asked me to consult on their ethics training module. That was the day I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was shaping something. 6 months later, I joined a nonprofit focused on medical justice reform. We traveled to universities, clinics, even legislative offices, speaking to anyone who would listen about the gray areas in family medical decisions. I wasn't the face of the movement. I didn't want to be. But I was in the room. I had a voice. And that was more than I'd ever had before. Then one morning I received a message from our HR department. We've got a new candidate for the upcoming project assistant role. Would love your input. They forwarded me the resume. Caleb Ellison. I stared at the name for a long time, heart silent, breath steady. He had a degree now, some basic credentials, a year of volunteer work in community health. It was a perfectly average application. There was no mention of me, of course. No indication he had any idea that the person reviewing his file was the sister he hadn't seen in almost 6 years. He didn't know. He had no clue that I was alive and not just surviving but thriving. He had no idea I had shed the name they gave me like a skin built an entire life from the ground up, that I was in a position to decide if he got a foot in the door. I thought about deleting the file. I thought about forwarding it to someone else to avoid conflict, but I didn't. I sent a reply to HR. Bring him in for an interview. I'll handle it. I didn't tell anyone who he was. I didn't prepare a speech. I didn't plan revenge. I just waited. When he walked into the conference room 2 days later, he looked older, less polished than I remembered. The shine had worn off. His shoulders were tense, his eyes tired. He offered a polite smile to the assistant, then stepped into the room. And stopped. Our eyes met. He knew instantly. Nora, he said, stunned. You're alive, I sat at the head of the table, fingers laced, face unreadable. Alive, healthy. Not a donor, not disposable. He stammered, I didn't know Mom said you. She said I lost my mind, that I ran away, that I betrayed the family. He said nothing. I heard what she said that night. Caleb. I was conscious. I heard her ask to use my body to save you. I heard Dad say nothing, and I remember you saying nothing too. I didn't know what to do, he said, voice cracking. I was scared. I was bleeding out, I said quietly. And I still remember choosing to live, for myself, because no one else in that ambulance chose me. He looked away. I didn't come here for this. No, I said. You came here for a job, but you walked into a reckoning. He opened his mouth to argue, but I raised a hand. This position requires empathy, integrity, and a history of advocating for vulnerable patients. Your resume shows none of that. He exhaled. So this is about revenge. No, I said. This is about memory. I stood gathering my things. There are places you can start over, but not here. As he left, I felt no triumph, no gloating, only peace, the kind you earn. After Caleb walked out of the interview room, I didn't speak to anyone for the rest of the afternoon. I closed my office door, muted my phone, and sat by the window overlooking the courtyard of the Ethics Institute. There were students walking to class, coffee in hand, backpacks slung over one shoulder, moving through the world as if it hadn't once tried to trade their organs for convenience. I watched them and felt something I hadn't in a long time. Not anger, not victory, stillness. I had done what I needed to do, not for vengeance, not to hurt him, just to close the loop. After that day, I stopped checking old emails. I stopped wondering whether my parents would ever try to reach me again. I stopped chasing the idea of healing through confrontation. Some stories don't get apologies. Some wounds stay red under the surface, but they don't have to stay open. Instead, I poured myself into the work. We finalized the policy paper on ethical consent for minors and presented it to a National Committee on Healthcare Reform. The reception was quiet but positive. Change doesn't always arrive with headlines. Sometimes it slips in through footnotes and gets written into protocol. Hospitals began asking for our guidelines. One in particular reached out and asked to implement our model fully. The director told me that their goal was to prevent even the possibility of what had happened to me from repeating, though they didn't know it had happened to me. That was how I wanted it. Not a sob story, a system change. By 25, I was speaking at conferences, not as the girl who'd nearly lost everything, but as a professional with experience. People asked me how I got into the field. I gave them the polished answer, I had an early exposure to the ethics of emergency medicine. It was technically true. One of my biggest breakthroughs came when I joined a legislative roundtable to review outdated family consent laws. I worked alongside pediatricians, trauma surgeons, legal scholars. I wasn't the youngest in the room, but I was the only one who had once been the patient with no voice. I didn't need to tell them that. It lived in the way I questioned everything. How do we define best interest when it's the parent who benefits? How do we prevent a child from being treated like a resource instead of a person who gets to decide when someone's life is worth saving? That year, I helped draft what became known in pilot form as the Veil Clause, aimed at giving underage patients the right to request an advocate outside their immediate family in high-risk medical decisions. It wasn't law yet, but it was being read in rooms that mattered, and that was enough. Outside of work, life was simple. I lived in a quiet apartment near the lake. I still read too much, still drank too much tea, still took long walks when the weather allowed. I made a few close friends, mostly people from work who respected my privacy without making a thing of it. I never told them everything, but they knew enough to understand that peace for me was not the absence of pain. It was the absence of danger. Sometimes I'd get letters, one from my old school, another from someone claiming to be a cousin I barely remembered. Once a card from my father, his handwriting shaky. A simple line, "We think of you every day." I never wrote back. I didn't need closure from people who didn't fight for me when it counted. Instead, I kept a folder in my drawer labeled Future. Inside were printed copies of every law we'd influenced, every policy we helped write, every hospital that cited our work. I added to it every few months, like a gardener checking the roots. That was my legacy. Not the pain, not the blood, not the betrayal, the rebuild, the law. The language. The proof that even when you've been treated like nothing, you can become the reason others never are. It was a gray afternoon in early spring when Rosa found me again. I hadn't seen her in years, not since the hospital. She reached out through the Institute's general email. The subject line read, "An old nurse hoping to reconnect." I recognized her name instantly. We met for coffee 2 days later in a quiet corner of a cafe near the university campus. She looked older, wiser somehow, but still had the same gentle presence. When she saw me walk in, her face lit up with something close to pride. "You look like someone who changed the world," she said. I smiled. "I'm just getting started." We talked for hours about the night of the accident, the days that followed, the silence we'd both carried. Rosa told me how hard it had been watching from the sidelines, knowing what she'd heard in that ambulance, but not being able to do more at the time. She said she never forgot the look in my eyes, the quiet plea for someone to see me, believe me, protect me. "I always wondered what happened to you," she said. "I never expected this." I told her what I had done. Not all the details, not every scar, but enough to let her know that I'd made it. That I hadn't just survived, but shaped a life out of the very thing that nearly destroyed me. Then she leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I saw your mother last month," she said. "She came into the hospital." My stomach tightened. "She didn't recognize me," Rosa continued. "But she was there with your father." He looked smaller than I remembered, tired. "They were asking about a financial support program. I think they're struggling." I said nothing. There was a time when that news would have brought me satisfaction, vindication even. But now it felt like reading a weather report from a town I no longer lived in. Rosa hesitated. She asked if the hospital ever found you, if you were okay. I looked down at my tea, the steam curling up like a question I didn't want to answer. She said she regretted how things happened, Rosa added, that she didn't know what came over her. She knew exactly what came over her, I said quietly. Control, fear, favoritism. She just never expected to lose. Rosa nodded slowly. "I thought you should know, in case it ever came back around." It did about 2 weeks later. A letter arrived at the institute, handwritten, no return address. But I recognized the penmanship, slanted cursive sharp loops, my mother's. Inside was a single page, no apology, just a plea. "Your brother is struggling. He can't find work. We're at risk of losing the house. We know things were said, but you're still our daughter. Please help us." I read it once, then again. Still our daughter. Funny how that title only seemed to apply when I was useful. I didn't cry. I didn't get angry. I simply walked over to my filing cabinet, pulled out a blank sheet of letterhead from the institute, and wrote back. "When I was unconscious, you offered my life as a solution. You did not ask if I wanted to be saved. You asked if I could be sacrificed. That was your choice. Now this is mine. No." I sealed the letter and mailed it the next morning. I didn't expect to hear back. And I didn't. Weeks passed. Spring turned to summer. The institute finalized a national ethics curriculum for emergency medicine, and my name was included as a co-author. The launch event was small but meaningful. A few journalists covered it. One headline read, "Former patient helps change the law that almost took her life." They didn't name me in full, just Nora V., consultant and research lead. It was enough. After the event, I stood alone on the building steps, watching the sun lower over the campus lawns. A soft breeze carried the sound of students laughing in the distance. Behind me on the bulletin board, someone had pinned a flyer about the new patient rights clause. At the bottom in small type, "This protocol exists to protect those who cannot protect themselves." Inspired by the lived experience of a survivor. That was me, and that was all the closure I would ever need. The day I received the final approval notice for the veil clause was quiet. No one rang bells, no parades, no flood of press releases or televised interviews. Just an email in my inbox signed off by a committee I had worked with for over a year. Their note was brief but respectful. "The clause has passed into official recommendation for state-level adoption. Thank you for your critical contributions." I sat back in my chair and let the silence wash over me. So this is what justice sounds like, I thought. Not loud, not vengeful, just final. That night I walked down to the lake where the air smelled of pine and dusk. I brought nothing but a pen and the small notebook Rosa had once given me, the very first one. The pages were wrinkled now, the ink faded in places, but the spine still held. On the very first page, I had written one line, "They chose him. You choose you." I read those words now not with sorrow, but with pride. So much had changed. Not all at once, not easily, But enough. I lived alone in a small apartment with a balcony that overlooked the water. I didn't need much, just books like quiet. I worked from home most days, writing and reviewing policy mentoring younger researchers who came into the field wanting to make a difference, but didn't yet know how much that would cost. Sometimes I told them a little of my story, not the gruesome parts, not the betrayal, just enough for them to understand the stakes. I told them the system we worked in had cracks wide enough to let lives fall through, and that if they wanted to fix it, they'd have to hold themselves accountable to more than checklists and protocols. They always listened closely. No one teaches you how to live after surviving something like I did. No one tells you how to carry on with ordinary things. Grocery shopping, choosing new curtains, learning to love silence that isn't born from fear. But I learned. There were days I woke up feeling 10 years older, and others when I caught myself laughing and realized this is what life should feel like. Not waiting for danger, not measuring your worth through someone else's eyes, just being. I never dated much. Trust wasn't something I could offer easily, but I had friends. People who called me when they were sad. People who laughed with me when we watched old movies on Friday nights. People who knew me as Nora Vale and respected her, not as a rebirth, not as a symbol, but simply as a person. And that I realized was the real victory, not the policy, not the clause, not even the letter I had sent back with the word no etched clearly in ink. It was this, that I had built a life no one could take from me. A life where I was not an organ, not a liability, not a burden, a life where I was whole. The hospital that had once treated me now used our work to train new residents. One of the doctors there emailed me last month. She said they were renaming a portion of their family ethics curriculum in my honor. Not my old name, not the name my parents gave me, but the one I chose, the Veil Protection Program. I smiled when I read it. Not because I needed recognition, but because it felt like a thread connecting all the versions of me that had fought to exist: the silent girl in the back seat, the broken girl on the stretcher, the steady one with a notebook, the advocate with a folder of policies, all of them standing together now, all of them surviving and thriving. Sometimes late at night I think about that ambulance. I can still feel the cold, hear the beeping machines, the rise and fall of voices debating whether I was worth saving. I remember the moment I realized I was alone, but more than that, I remember the moment I decided I wouldn't be alone forever, that I would build something, not to prove anything to them, but to give something back to the version of me who lay there powerless and afraid. And to any other girl or boy or child or person who has ever been told they are worth less than someone else, I say this: you are not a spare part. You are not a burden. You are not disposable. You are the beginning of your own story. And no one, no matter how loud, how powerful, how entitled, can take that away from you. I signed the last page of the notebook that night. Just a name, not a message. Nora Vale. Then I closed it and set it on the shelf beside every paper, policy, and letter that once defined my fight. Now they just mark my peace.